They drift in the dark between asteroids, silent and hollow. Relics of an age most have forgotten. To the untrained eye, they are little more than ruins. But to those who know where to look, the QV stations tell a story that stretches back centuries. A story of ambition, collapse, refuge, and slow decay. Welcome to Citizen Lore, where we dive into the history of the verse. Today we explore the QV Stations of Nyx, where they came from, what they made possible, and how, centuries later, they are still shaping the system around them. The year was 2582. The United Earth Empire was at the height of its territorial expansion, charting new systems and planting its flag across the stars. Among the systems surveyed during this period was Nyx, a cold, resource-rich, and deeply inhospitable corner of the verse. The UEE's assessment was swift and unambiguous. None of Nyx's 3 planets were viable for terraforming, and while the Glacier Ring and the Keegar Belt held valuable minerals, the dangers of extracting them were deemed too great. The system was quietly passed over. No formal claim was made. Nyx was left to the dark. But where governments hesitate, private enterprise often does not. In 2589, a mining corporation registered as QV Planet Services set its sights on Nyx. Who founded the company and what the initials QV stand for has been lost to time. What is known is that QV Planet Services arrived in Nyx with substantial resources and considerable ambition. Construction began rapidly, and the scale of it was remarkable. Across the asteroid fields of Nyx, the company erected an extensive network of mining infrastructure, refineries, processing hubs, transport corridors, and the stations that would carry the company's name for centuries after it ceased to exist. At the heart of this network were the QV breaker stations. These were not ordinary outposts. They were massive, purpose-built industrial platforms, engineered to fracture the largest rocks in the belt and extract the high-value minerals locked within them. Each one was a self-contained operation, heavy fracturing machinery at its core, surrounded by processing bays, crew quarters, and docking facilities capable of handling industrial-scale traffic. For a time, the investment paid off. Mining was profitable. The stations operated as intended, and QV Planet Services carved out a foothold in a system no one else had wanted. But it did not last. The precise circumstances of QV Planet Services' downfall are not fully documented, but the broad outline is clear. Another mining operation, better positioned, better funded, or simply luckier, discovered comparable mineral deposits elsewhere and could extract them at a lower cost. Prices fell. Profit margins collapsed. QV Planet Services, unable to compete, began to fall apart. Rather than dismantling their stations, a costly and time-consuming process, the company's leadership made a different choice. They used what remained of their capital to recoup their investors, choosing to abandon all their equipment in Nyx. The stations themselves were left behind, empty, pressurized, but silent. The company formally ceased operations in 2644, though the stations had likely been abandoned for years before that date. By the time the last administrator filed the final report, the QV stations were already ghosts, vast industrial structures drifting in the asteroid fields of a system that no one was watching. The pattern will be familiar to those who know the history of the Pyro system. There, decades earlier, a company called Pyrotechnical Amalgamated had followed the same arc, entering an unclaimed system, building extensively, and ultimately collapsing under external pressures, leaving their infrastructure behind. History, in the verse, has a habit of repeating itself. The stations did not remain empty for long. Beginning around 2618, the first political refugees began arriving in Nyx. These were men and women fleeing the authoritarian reach of the UEE's Messer regime, dissidents, political exiles, and those who simply could no longer live under imperial rule. They needed somewhere to go, somewhere beyond the UEE's reach, beyond its laws, beyond its enforcers. They found it in the abandoned infrastructure of QV Planet Services. The first recorded settlement was established at a QV station on the asteroid Delamar, a location that would eventually become known as Levski. At the time of occupation, the station had been empty for only a few years, perhaps a decade at most. Its systems were still intact, its structure was sound, the equipment left behind by QV Planet Services, the processing facilities, the docking bays, the life support infrastructure was still largely functional. For refugees arriving with little more than what they could carry, it was an extraordinary stroke of luck. There is a deep irony in that fortune, though, one that would not have been lost on the people settling there. The refugees who would go on to found the People's Alliance held a philosophy explicitly opposed to corporate power and UEE imperialism. And yet they owed their very survival to a corporation's abandoned assets. The same profit-driven logic they rejected had in its failure handed them exactly what they needed: a network of modern, functional stations built by a company that no longer existed in a system that no one else wanted. The collapse of QV Planet Services had entirely by accident made the birth of an anti-corporate, anti-imperialist, independent state possible. Settlement spread. More groups arrived. More stations were occupied. Slowly, something remarkable began to take shape. What had been empty industrial platforms became communities. Markets opened. Workshops were established. Families put down roots in corridors that had once known only the noise of machinery. People built lives in places that were never designed for living. And in 2655, several years after QV Planet Services had finally closed its doors for good, the People's Alliance of Levski was formally founded. An independent authority, built on the remains of a bankrupt mining company, had established itself as the governing power of the Nyx system. It was, by any measure, a remarkable achievement, and it would not have been possible without the QV stations. Time, however, is patient. The stations that had seemed such a fortunate find in the early years of settlement were not built for permanence. Mining infrastructure is designed for a specific purpose: extract resources efficiently, then be dismantled. The QV stations were never intended to house communities for generations. They were never designed to last centuries. As the decades passed, the limitations of that design became increasingly apparent. Equipment failures grew more frequent. Systems that had once run automatically required constant manual attention. Corridors and modules, built for industrial use, were never meant to bear the wear of daily habitation across generations. The People's Alliance, a regional power, but never a wealthy one, found itself allocating more and more of its limited resources simply to keep its stations operational. Resources that might otherwise have gone toward expansion, defense, or diplomacy were swallowed by the endless work of maintenance. Some inhabited stations were quietly abandoned as upkeep became untenable. The People's Alliance's grip on Nyx loosened, and the stations left vacant once again, structurally intact, isolated, and well beyond the reach of any authority, did not go unnoticed. For the criminal organizations beginning to filter into Nyx during this period, those abandoned stations were an ideal gift. They required no investment, no construction, no negotiation. They offered shelter, concealment, and a ready-made base of operations in a system where no one was likely to ask questions. Groups like the Shattered Blade, operators with ties to Vandal technology smuggling, established themselves in these locations not to live in them, but to strike from them. Raids, ambushes, smuggling runs, all launched from platforms the People's Alliance had neither the resources nor the reach to reclaim. The Vandal raids that followed further strained the Alliance's already stretched capacity, accelerating the very decline that had created the opportunity in the first place. The decline deepened further in recent decades. With the fall of the Mesa regime and the gradual democratization of the UEE, the People's Alliance lost much of the political purpose that had defined it since its founding. The existential threat that had driven refugees to Nyx no longer existed in the same form, and the deteriorating condition of their stations, brought into sharp focus by the Melina mold crisis, in which a spreading biological contamination threatened to render entire sections of the station uninhabitable, pushed the organization to its limits. The crisis was a stark illustration of just how fragile the Alliance's infrastructure had become, and how much it relied on the QV stations. Stand inside an abandoned QV breaker station today, and the centuries collapse around you. The machinery is still there, The same fracturing platforms, the same docking architecture, the same corridors laid out by engineers who have been gone for generations. Nobody came back to change any of it. Nobody came back at all. What QV Planet Services left behind when it quietly folded in 2644 is in many places exactly what you will find today, preserved not by care or intention, but simply by the indifference of time. The People's Alliance, the independent state whose entire existence was made possible by these abandoned platforms, is still here, older, weaker, but still fighting on to endure. The infrastructure that gave the Alliance life has been demanding repayment ever since. Every year, more resources are consumed by maintenance. Every year, the managed decay advances a little further. The stations helped build the Alliance, and now the stations are slowly unmaking it. In the sectors the Alliance no longer controls, others have moved in. The same isolation that made these platforms a sanctuary for political refugees centuries ago makes them equally valuable to those who prefer to operate without scrutiny. The QV stations asked little of the refugees who first arrived in Nyx. They ask nothing of the criminals who use them now. They simply endure and serve whoever comes. And then there is the UEE, which once dismissed this system as not worth the trouble, is now circling back. Intersect patrols fly where Vandul raiders once went unchallenged. Nyx 1 is being terraformed successfully. Senators debate formal annexation or colonization, and Shubin Interstellar, a corporate giant, not unlike the one that built these stations and abandoned them centuries ago, is handing out mining rights for the breaker stations to those willing to brave these old and dangerous locations. They drift in the dark between asteroids, silent and hollow, just as they always have. The age that built them is long forgotten. The company that raised them exists only in records, and yet they remain, patient and indifferent, shaping the history of a system simply by continuing to stand. The QV stations are not just a fixture of Nyx. They are what makes Nyx, Nyx. Without them, there's no Alliance, no Levski, no tech smugglers, no story, just an empty system the UEE glanced at once and forgot. Everything this system became, every life lived here, every rock mined here, every ideal defended here, grew from the bones of a company that failed and walked away. The verse moved on, the station stayed, and that in the end made all the difference. Thanks for watching Citizen Lore. If you enjoyed this one, consider subscribing. There's plenty more forgotten corners of the verse waiting to be found. Until next time, fly safe out there.